She never imagined that a single fall would change her life forever. At 22, Violet Mercer, principal dancer of the New York City Ballet, collapses in the marble hallway of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Before she can hit the floor, she is caught in the strong arms of Julian Ashford, a 38-year-old millionaire and owner of one of the largest construction companies in the United States. What begins as an instinctive act of protection sparks an intense connection, powerful enough to turn pain into strength and reveal a love neither of them ever expected to find. The marble floor of Le Bernardin gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, reflecting the soft murmur of Manhattan's elite enjoying their evening of culinary excellence. Julian Ashford adjusted his Tom Ford cufflinks as he stepped out of the men's room, his mind already returning to the construction contracts waiting on his desk. At 38, he had built Ashford Construction into one of the most powerful companies on the East Coast, and success demanded constant attention to detail. He was thinking about the new development in Brooklyn when he saw her falling. Time slowed to a crawl. The young woman's knees buckled in the middle of the corridor, her delicate frame crumpling like a flower in a sudden frost. Without conscious thought, Julian's long strides closed the distance between them. His arms swept beneath her, just as gravity claimed her, pulling her against his chest before she could hit the unforgiving marble. Christ, she weighs nothing, he thought, alarm bells ringing in his head as he felt how light she was in his arms. Her body was all sharp angles and hollow spaces where curves should have been, like holding a bird with broken wings. Violet's eyelashes fluttered as consciousness returned slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark pool. The first thing she registered was warmth, solid, masculine warmth that enveloped her completely. The second was a scent that made her pulse quicken, sandalwood, and something uniquely masculine that spoke to parts of her she'd long forgotten existed. When her eyes opened fully, she found herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. They were the color of a storm over the Atlantic, framed by dark lashes that would make any woman envious. The face that held those eyes was ruggedly handsome, with a square jaw covered in perfectly trimmed stubble, and lips that looked both firm and surprisingly gentle. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Easy. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest. Don't try to move too quickly. She became aware that she was cradled against a chest that felt like it was carved from granite, wrapped in what was clearly an expensive suit. The man holding her was tall, she could tell even from her current position, with shoulders broad enough to block out the rest of the restaurant. His dark hair was styled with casual precision, and when he looked down at her, those storm blue eyes held a concern that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I'm so sorry, she whispered, trying to push away from him, but her arms had all the strength of cooked spaghetti. Please, I can stand. But Julian's arms tightened around her, not possessively but protectively. Something about her fragility triggered every protective instinct he'd spent years learning to control. She was beautiful, heartbreakingly so, with chocolate brown eyes that seemed too large for her face and skin, that had a translucent quality that worried him. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck, but he could see wisps of honey gold escaping to frame her face. When did you last eat? The question came out more sharply than he'd intended, but he couldn't help himself. He'd seen that particular combination of pallor and weakness before, and it never ended well. Violet's eyes darted away from his, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheekbones. I had lunch, it's fine, really. I just stood up too quickly. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but what else could she say? That she'd had half a rice cake and black coffee at noon, and before that, a single apple for breakfast. That her mother had started weighing her food when she turned 18, and the portions had gotten smaller every year since. Julian studied her face with the same attention to detail that had made him successful in business. Her eyes wouldn't meet his, and there was a tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with physical weakness. Her wrists, where they emerged from the sleeves of her oversized sweater, were so thin he could probably circle them with his thumb and forefinger. She's lying, he realized, and the knowledge sent a cold spike of anger through him. Not anger at her, never at her, but at whatever or whoever had reduced this ethereal creature to a shadow of what she should be. "Let me take you to the hospital," he said. his voice gentler now but still holding that note of command that made boardrooms fall silent when he spoke. "No!" The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw his eyebrows raise slightly. "I mean, that's really not necessary. I'm sure I just need some air." But as she tried again to stand, her legs betrayed her once more. Julian caught her easily, lifting her completely into his arms as if she weighed no more than a child. The action brought their faces closer together, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Violet felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with his body heat and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, as if she mattered, as if she was worth protecting. It was a feeling so foreign that it made her eyes burn with unshed tears. Julian found himself momentarily mesmerized by her nearness. This close, he could see that her eyes weren't just brown. They were the color of aged whiskey, with gold flecks that caught the light when she breathed. Her lips, though pale from whatever was wrong with her, were perfectly shaped, with a slight fullness that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with protective instincts. "Focus, Ashford," he commanded himself. "She needs help, not complications." "My car is right outside," he said, his voice rougher than before. "I'm taking you to Mount Sinai. No arguments." As he carried her through the restaurant, Violet was dimly aware of the stares they were attracting, but for once in her life she didn't care what people thought. She was too focused on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear, too overwhelmed by the novelty of being held with such careful strength. When they reached his Bentley, of course it was a Bentley, sleek and black as midnight, Julian settled her gently in the passenger seat, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary as he made sure she was secure. As he pulled into Manhattan traffic, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Violet stole glances at his profile, the strong line of his nose, the way his hands looked both elegant and powerful on the steering wheel, the concentration that furrowed his brow as he navigated the busy streets. Julian was hyper-aware of every small movement she made, every soft breath, every time her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Questions burned in his throat. Who was she? What had brought her to this point? And why did every protective instinct he possessed seem to be screaming at him to shield her from whatever was hurting her? They were halfway to the hospital when she finally spoke again, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it over the city noise. "Thank you," she whispered. People don't usually—" She trailed off, but Julian understood. People don't usually care. People don't usually notice. The thought made his hands tighten on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Violet," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Violet Mercer." Julian Ashford. He glanced over at her, those blue eyes intense even in profile. "And Violet? Whatever's happening to you, whatever's making you collapse in restaurants, it's not okay. You deserve better than this." The simple words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. When had anyone last told her she deserved better? When had anyone cared enough to even notice that something was wrong? As the lights of Mount Sinai came into view, Violet realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated. The man beside her, this stranger with gentle hands and storm-colored eyes, had somehow seen through every carefully constructed facade she'd built around herself, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure whether that terrified her or gave her hope. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was a symphony of controlled chaos, but Julian's presence seemed to create a bubble of calm around them. Violet watched in amazement as he spoke quietly to the triage nurse, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made things happen without raised voices or demands. Within minutes, she was being escorted to a private examination room. "Mr. Ashford, you don't have to stay," she said, as he settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed, looking ridiculously out of place in his expensive suit among the sterile hospital furnishings. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied simply, and something in his tone told her that arguing would be pointless. Why? The question echoed in her mind as she lay back against the thin pillow. Why would a complete stranger, a man who could clearly have any woman he wanted, waste his evening in a hospital with someone like her? Julian found himself studying her face as they waited for the doctor. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Her pallor was even more pronounced, and he could see faint purple shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Her hands, resting on top of the thin hospital blanket, were elegant with long, graceful fingers, but they seemed almost fragile, as if they might snap if he touched them too firmly. She's a dancer, he realized suddenly, recognizing the particular way she held herself, the turnout of her feet even when she was lying down. Everything about her spoke of years of discipline and training, but also of something being pushed too far. Dr. Sarah Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who took one look at Violet and immediately began asking the kinds of questions that made her patient shift uncomfortably. "When did you last have a full meal, Ms. Mercer?" "I eat regularly, doctor. I think I just got a little dehydrated. Your blood pressure is dangerously low, and your blood sugar has crashed completely." "This isn't dehydration." Dr. Chen's voice was kind but firm. "Can you tell me what you typically eat in a day?" Violet's eyes darted to Julian, who was listening with an expression of growing concern. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks as she mumbled something about following a strict diet for her profession. What profession would that be? "I'm a ballet dancer, with the New York City Ballet." The doctor nodded knowingly, and Julian saw her expression grow more serious. "Ms. Mercer, I need you to be honest with me. How many calories would you estimate you consume daily?" The silence that followed was deafening. Violet's hands clenched the blanket so tightly her knuckles went white, and Julian could see her internal struggle as clearly as if it were written across her face. My mother helps me plan my meals. She says 800 calories is appropriate for my body type and profession." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. Julian felt every muscle in his body tense, a cold rage building in his chest that had nothing to do with Violet, and everything to do with whoever had convinced her that slow starvation was acceptable. 800, Dr. Chen repeated flatly. "Ms. Mercer, a woman your age and activity level should be consuming at least twice that amount. What you're describing isn't a diet. It's severe restriction that's causing your body to shut down." Julian's hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. He thought of his sister Emma, of the way she'd started making excuses about food, of how he'd been too busy building his company to notice until it was almost too late. The familiar weight of guilt settled on his shoulders, but this time it was mixed with something fiercer, a determination not to let history repeat itself. "Your mother plans your meals?" he asked quietly, his voice carefully controlled. Violet nodded miserably. "She was a dancer, too, at American Ballet Theatre. She knows what it takes to succeed. The competition is so fierce, and if you're not perfect..." "Perfect." The word came out of Julian's mouth like a curse. "Violet, look at me." Reluctantly, she turned those whiskey-colored eyes to meet his, and he saw shame there that made his chest ache. "You are not a horse to be trained. You are not a machine to be optimized. You are a human being, and human beings need food to survive." His voice was low and intense, every word carefully chosen. "What your mother is doing to you, this isn't love. It's not protection, it's abuse." "No." The protest burst out of her before she could stop it. "You don't understand. She sacrificed everything for my career. She gave up her own dreams so you could what? Collapse in restaurants, destroy your body before you turn 25. Julian leaned forward, his blue eyes blazing with an emotion that took her breath away. "Violet, when you fell tonight, you were unconscious before you hit the ground. Do you understand how dangerous that is? What if I hadn't been there?" The question hung between them, and Violet felt something crack inside her chest. Because the truth was, she had been getting dizzy more often lately. She had been ignoring the way her heart raced when she climbed stairs, the way her vision tunneled during particularly difficult rehearsals. She had been telling herself it was just part of the sacrifice required for her art. "I have to discharge you with instructions to increase your caloric intake immediately," Dr. Chen said gently. "I'm also recommending that you see a nutritionist who specializes in working with dancers. This level of restriction isn't sustainable, Ms. Mercer. Your body can't continue to function this way." As the doctor left to prepare the discharge paperwork, silence fell over the small room. Violet stared at her hands, unable to meet Julian's eyes, while he struggled with the urge to pull her into his arms and promise her that no one would ever hurt her again. "She'll be furious," Violet whispered finally. "My mother. When she finds out I was in the hospital, When she hears what the doctor said, let her be furious. Julian's voice was steel wrapped in silk. You're 22 years old, Violet. You have the right to make your own decisions about your body and your health. She looked up at him then, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. You don't understand. I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have money of my own, and if she cuts me off, then I'll help you. The words came out before he could stop them, surprising them both. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. I barely know you. But even as he said it, Julian knew it wasn't true. He felt like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet her, like every decision he'd made had somehow led him to that moment in the restaurant when she'd needed someone to catch her. Violet stared at him in wonder. This man, this stranger with his expensive clothes and powerful presence, was offering to help her. Not because he wanted something from her, but simply because she needed help. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that for someone you just met? Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. Because I had a sister who stopped eating. I was too busy, too focused on building my company to notice how thin she was getting, how she started making excuses not to eat with the family. By the time I realized what was happening, her body had been deprived for so long that... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I'm sorry, Violet said softly, and without thinking, she reached out to touch his hand. The contact sent electricity, shooting up both their arms, a connection that neither of them had expected. Julian looked down at her small hand covering his and felt something fundamental shift inside him. I swore I would never let anyone else suffer the way she did. And I meant it. When the discharge paperwork was complete, Julian insisted on taking Violet home, though she protested weakly that she could take the subway. Absolutely not, he said, helping her into his coat when she shivered in the cool night air. The gesture was so natural, so protective, that it brought tears to her eyes again. As they drove through the glittering streets of Manhattan, Violet found herself stealing glances at his profile again. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hands looked both elegant and capable on the steering wheel, everything about him spoke of power and control, but also of a gentleness that made her feel safe in a way she couldn't remember ever feeling before. Violet, he said, as they stopped at a red light, turning to look at her with those storm-blue eyes. I want you to promise me something. What? Promise me that if you feel faint again, if you start to feel weak or dizzy, you'll call me. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to her. That's my personal number. Day or night, it doesn't matter. Call me. She took the card with trembling fingers, looking down at the bold script of his handwriting. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me. Because everyone deserves kindness, Violet, and you haven't been getting nearly enough of it. As they pulled up in front of her apartment building, a modest brownstone in the village that she shared with 3 other dancers, Julian came around to open her door, offering his hand to help her out. The simple courtesy made her heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with low blood sugar. Will I see you again? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Julian stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. In the streetlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, but his expression was infinitely gentle. You'll see me again, he promised, his voice low and certain. Take care of yourself, Violet Mercer, and remember what I said. You deserve better than what you've been settling for. As she watched his Bentley disappear into the late-night traffic, Violet touched the business card in her pocket and allowed herself to hope, just for a moment, that her life might be about to change in ways she'd never dared to imagine. 3 days passed before Violet saw any sign of Julian Ashford again, though he occupied her thoughts far more than she cared to admit. She had thrown herself back into her rehearsal schedule at Lincoln Center with renewed determination, as if she could dance away the memory of those storm-blue eyes and the way his voice had sounded when he'd promised she deserved better. Her mother, Helena Mercer, had been predictably furious about the hospital visit. 800 calories is perfectly adequate for a professional dancer, she'd snapped, pacing the cramped kitchen of their Upper West Side apartment like a caged lioness. That doctor doesn't understand the demands of your profession. Neither did that man, whoever he was. Violet had been careful not to mention Julian's name. instinctively knowing that her mother's reaction would be even worse if she knew the kind of man who had helped her. Helena had always been suspicious of anyone who might threaten her control over her daughter's career and life. "I'm fine, Mother," Violet had insisted, though the lie tasted bitter. She wasn't fine. She was tired all the time. Her bones ached, and sometimes she caught herself staring at the business card Julian had given her, wondering what would happen if she was brave enough to call. It was during her lunch break on Thursday that she found the first gift. She had settled onto her usual bench in Central Park, the one overlooking the reservoir, where she could watch the joggers and pretend she was just another 22-year-old enjoying a beautiful autumn day instead of a dancer trying to make a single rice cake last for 30 minutes. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of Julian's eyes when he'd looked at her in the hospital. "Stop thinking about him," she commanded herself. But before she could take a bite of her meager lunch, she noticed the small paper bag sitting on the other end of the bench. Her name was written on it in bold, masculine handwriting that made her pulse quicken. Inside was a perfect red apple and a small note. "Because you deserve real food. J." Violet looked around the park wildly, half expecting to see Julian watching her from behind one of the massive oak trees, but there was no sign of him. Just the apple, gleaming like a ruby in the afternoon sunlight, and a kindness so simple it brought tears to her eyes. How did he know where to find me, she wondered. But even as the question formed, she found herself biting into the apple. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, and she had to close her eyes against the sudden rush of flavor. When had food started tasting like cardboard? When had she stopped noticing the difference between nourishment and mere survival? Julian watched from his position near the museum entrance, close enough to see her reaction, but far enough away that she wouldn't spot him. He'd had his assistant research her schedule, a breach of privacy that would normally have bothered him, but desperation made him rationalize his actions. She needed help, and if anonymous gifts were the only way to provide it without triggering her obvious anxiety about accepting help, then so be it. Seeing her bite into the apple with such evident pleasure sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the mild October weather. She was beautiful when she wasn't shrinking into herself, when that careful mask of control slipped to reveal the vibrant woman underneath. "Christ, Ashford, you're following her around like some kind of stalker," he thought grimly, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not when she looked so alone on that bench, not when he could still see the sharp angles of her shoulders through her thin sweater. The gifts continued throughout the week, always appearing when she was at her most vulnerable moments. A protein bar left in her dressing room at Lincoln Center after a particularly brutal rehearsal with Madame Volkoff, who had a reputation for reducing dancers to tears with a single withering glance. A smoothie, mango and protein powder, creamy and substantial, waiting by the stage door when she emerged exhausted from a late-night practice session. Each gift came with a note, never more than a few words, but each one seemed to know exactly what she needed to hear. "You danced beautifully today. Strength requires fuel. You are worth taking care of." Violet began to look forward to these mysterious appearances, with an anticipation that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She would find herself scanning crowds for a familiar tall figure, listening for that low voice that had promised she deserved better. But Julian remained a phantom, present only in his thoughtful gifts and the way they made her feel, seen, valued, protected. Her body began to respond to the additional nutrition almost immediately. The constant headaches that had become her normal faded, and she found herself with energy she hadn't possessed in months. During rehearsals, she could execute jumps that had been beyond her reach, hold extensions that would have left her trembling before. But it was more than the physical changes. Something inside her was awakening, a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. She caught herself humming in the shower, smiling at strangers on the subway, feeling an optimism that had nothing to do with her career prospects and everything to do with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was thinking of her well-being. Helena noticed the change immediately. "You're getting soft," she observed critically, watching Violet eat what was supposed to be her carefully portioned dinner. "Your face is filling out. The cameras will pick up every ounce, you know." "I've actually been dancing better," Violet replied quietly, a spark of defiance that surprised them both. "My jumps are higher, my balance is more stable, Because you're not pushing yourself hard enough, Helena cut her off sharply. Comfort is the enemy of excellence, Violet. You can't afford to get complacent now, not when you're so close to a principal role. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom that still held her collection of music boxes and faded posters of Margot Fontaine, Violet pulled out Julian's business card for the 100th time. The edges were worn soft from her handling, but his phone number was still clearly visible. What would happen if I called him, she wondered. What would I even say? But the questions were hypothetical, because she lacked the courage to find out. What if he'd lost interest? What if the gifts weren't really from him? What if she was just another charity case to a man who clearly had the resources to help anyone he chose? Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse office overlooking the Hudson River, Julian was having his own internal battle. What had started as a simple desire to help someone in need had evolved into something far more complicated. He found himself thinking about Violet at the most inappropriate times, during board meetings, while reviewing construction reports, in the middle of conversations with clients. He'd increased his morning runs through Central Park, telling himself it was for fitness but knowing he was hoping to catch a glimpse of her. He'd had his driver take unnecessarily long routes past Lincoln Center. He was, by any reasonable definition, becoming obsessed with a woman he'd spoken to for maybe an hour total. This is insane, he told himself as he stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the lights of Manhattan. She's 22 years old. She's dealing with serious issues, and you're a 38-year-old man who should know better than to get involved in something this complicated. But even as his rational mind listed all the reasons this was a bad idea, he found himself remembering the way she'd felt in his arms that first night, fragile and strong simultaneously, like spun glass wrapped around a steel core. He remembered the way her eyes had widened when he'd told her she deserved better, as if no one had ever said those words to her before. The thought of her going back to that existence, counting calories like a miser counting coins, slowly disappearing until there was nothing left but shadows and hollow spaces, made his chest tighten with a protectiveness that went far beyond what was appropriate for a stranger. His phone rang, startling him from his brooding. The caller ID made him frown. It was Marcus Webb, the private investigator he sometimes used for background checks on potential business partners. "Julian, I have that information you requested about Helena Mercer." Julian had commissioned the report in a moment of protective fury, needing to understand what kind of woman would deliberately starve her own daughter. Now, hearing the grim tone in Marcus's voice, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Give me the summary." "She's a piece of work," Marcus said bluntly. "Former dancer, like you suspected. But she was never as successful as she claims. Got pregnant at 23, never made it past the core at ABT. The father disappeared and she's been living vicariously through the daughter ever since. There are some financial issues too. They're living on credit cards and whatever the daughter brings in from performances." Julian's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of financial issues?" "The kind that make controlling your daughter's career a matter of survival, not just ambition. If Violet Mercer stops dancing, or if her career stalls, they lose everything." The information settled in Julian's stomach like a stone. Helena Mercer wasn't just a controlling stage mother. She was a woman whose entire existence depended on her daughter's success, which meant she would fight with desperate ferocity against anyone who threatened that success. And a man encouraging Violet to eat, to prioritize her health over her appearance, would definitely be seen as a threat. This just got a lot more complicated, Julian thought grimly, but his resolve only hardened. Violet was trapped in a system that was slowly killing her, held in place by financial chains as much as emotional manipulation. But Julian Ashford hadn't built a construction empire by backing down from complicated situations, and he'd be damned if he was going to let a frightened, greedy woman destroy the most beautiful soul he'd ever encountered. It was time to change his strategy from anonymous gifts to direct action. Tomorrow he would find a way to see Violet again, face to face. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate process of setting her free. The Lincoln Center Plaza was bustling with the usual afternoon crowd when Julian arrived, having finally worked up the courage to stop hiding behind anonymous gifts. He'd spent the morning in meetings, but his mind had been elsewhere, rehearsing what he would say when he saw Violet again. Now standing outside the David H. Koch Theater with its soaring glass facade, he felt as nervous as a teenager on his first date. "You're a grown man," he reminded himself. "Act like one." He didn't have to wait long. At precisely 3:15, the stage door opened and dancers began emerging from afternoon rehearsal. Julian recognized several faces from programs he'd researched online, but when Violet appeared, every other person in the plaza seemed to fade into background noise. She was wearing soft pink tights and a black leotard under a thin wrap sweater, her hair still pulled back in the severe bun required for class. She should have looked like any other dancer heading home after practice, but to Julian, she was luminous. The additional nutrition from his gifts had put a subtle glow in her cheeks, and she moved with more energy than she'd had that first night. She was so focused on digging through her worn dance bag that she didn't notice him approaching until his shadow fell across her. "Hello, Violet." Her head snapped up, those whiskey-colored eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she just stared at him, taking in the perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the way the afternoon sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the intensity of his gaze as it roamed over her face, as if he was memorizing every detail. "Julian?" she breathed, and the way his name sounded on her lips sent heat spiraling through his chest. "What are you... How did you..." "The gifts," he said simply. "They were from me." A flush rose in her cheeks, part embarrassment, part something deeper that made his pulse quicken. "I thought they might be, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know if I should call, or if you really wanted me to, or..." "Violet." His voice was gentle but firm, cutting through her nervous rambling. "I've been thinking about you every day since that night at the restaurant." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Julian had built his fortune on careful strategy and calculated risks, but something about this woman stripped away all his practiced defenses. "You have." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Instead of answering, he stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Close enough that she could catch that scent that had haunted her dreams, sandalwood and something uniquely masculine that made her knees feel weak. "Have dinner with me," he said, and it wasn't really a question. "I can't." The response was automatic, learned from years of her mother's restrictions. "I have a performance tomorrow night, and my diet has been slowly killing you." Julian's voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath. "When did you last have a real meal, Violet? Not a rice cake or half an apple, but actual food." She opened her mouth to protest, to recite the carefully rehearsed explanations about professional dancers and body maintenance, but the words died when she saw the expression in his eyes. He wasn't judging her. He was worried about her, in a way that made her chest ache with unfamiliar emotion. She started, then stopped, because the truth was, she couldn't remember. The gifts he'd been leaving had been the most substantial food she'd consumed in months, and even those had been eaten with guilt and anxiety about what her mother would say if she found out. "There's a small Italian place in the village," Julian continued, his voice low and persuasive. "Family-owned, quiet. They make fresh pasta that would put Le Bernardin to shame. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make you uncomfortable. Say no," the rational part of her mind whispered. "You don't know this man. He's too powerful, too intense, too everything." But a stronger voice, one that had been growing louder since that first night in his arms, was saying something entirely different. "My mother expects me home by 6, she said finally, the words coming out in a rush before she could change her mind. Julian's smile was slow and devastating, transforming his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely breathtaking. "Then we'll have you home by 6. 20 minutes later, Violet found herself in Julian's Bentley again. But this time she wasn't unconscious and fighting for breath. This time she was hyper-aware of everything, the way his hands looked on the steering wheel, the subtle scent of his cologne in the enclosed space, the way he kept glancing over at her, as if he couldn't quite believe she was really there. "Tell me about dancing," he said, as they navigated the busy streets. "When did you know that's what you wanted to do?" "I didn't choose it," Violet replied without thinking, then looked surprised at her own honesty. "I mean, my mother started taking me to classes when I was 3. She said I had natural talent." "That's not what I asked." Julian's voice was mild, but she heard the perceptiveness underneath. "I asked when you knew you wanted to do it." The distinction hit her like a physical blow, because the truth was, she wasn't sure she had ever made that choice for herself. Dancing was simply what she did, what she'd always done, the center around which her entire existence revolved. I've never really thought about it that way," she admitted quietly. Julian pulled up in front of a small restaurant with ivy climbing its brick walls and warm light spilling from mullioned windows. It was exactly as he'd described, intimate, welcoming, the kind of place where you could disappear from the world for a few hours. "Don't think about it now," he said softly, coming around to open her door. "Just be here with me." The restaurant was nearly empty in the late afternoon lull, and the owner, an elderly Italian man with kind eyes, greeted Julian like family. They were seated at a corner table away from the windows, giving them privacy, while still allowing Violet to feel safe and unobserved. "You come here often?" she asked, noting the easy familiarity. "Giovanni helped my crew when we were renovating a building in the neighborhood a few years ago. Free lunch every day for 3 months. Julian's eyes crinkled with genuine affection. "He's been trying to fatten me up ever since." The comment was casual, but Violet caught the subtle message underneath. This was a place where food was love, where nourishment was celebrated rather than feared. When Giovanni appeared with menus, Julian waved him away with a smile. "Trust us, Gio. Something that will make her remember why eating is one of life's greatest pleasures." Violet's cheeks heated at the way he said it, at the implication that he was thinking about other great pleasures they might share. The thought should have frightened her. She barely knew this man, but instead it sent warmth spiraling through her body in places that had been cold for too long. While they waited for their food, Julian found himself studying her with the same attention he gave to architectural blueprints. In the soft restaurant lighting, he could see that her skin had lost some of that translucent quality that had worried him so much. Her eyes were brighter, more alert. The gifts were working, but she was still far too thin, still carrying herself with the careful precision of someone afraid of taking up too much space. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, echoing the question she'd asked in the hospital. Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth he was ready to share. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because—" He trailed off, unable to find words for the way she made him feel. How could he explain that she'd become the center of his thoughts, that her well-being had somehow become more important to him than his own peace of mind? "Because," she prompted softly. Instead of answering, Julian reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The contact was electric. Her skin was soft and warm, and he could feel the calluses from years of dance practice, evidence of her strength and dedication. "Because you're extraordinary," he said simply. "And extraordinary women deserve to be protected and cherished, not controlled and diminished." Violet stared down at their joined hands, overwhelmed by the simple intimacy of the gesture. His hands were exactly as she'd imagined, strong and elegant, with long fingers and carefully maintained nails. They made her own hands look delicate by comparison, but not in a way that made her feel weak, in a way that made her feel feminine and protected. When their food arrived, homemade fettuccine in a light cream sauce with herbs from Giovanni's garden, Violet felt a moment of panic. The portion was generous, real restaurant-sized, rather than the careful measures she was used to. "I can't eat all of this," she whispered, genuine distress in her voice. Julian's thumb stroked across her knuckles, a soothing gesture that somehow calmed her racing heart. "You don't have to eat all of it. Just eat what feels good, what tastes good." The first bite was a revelation. The pasta was silky and perfect, the sauce rich without being heavy, the herbs adding a brightness that made her close her eyes in involuntary pleasure. When she opened them again, Julian was watching her with an expression that made her stomach flutter for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. "Good?" he asked, his voice rougher than before. "It's incredible," she breathed, taking another bite. "I'd forgotten that food could taste like this." They talked while she ate, conversation flowing easier than either of them had expected. Julian told her about his work, about the satisfaction of taking empty lots and turning them into homes where families would build their lives. Violet found herself sharing stories about dance that she'd never told anyone. Not the polished anecdotes about performance and technique that her mother had taught her to recite, but the real moments of joy and frustration that came with dedicating your life to an art form. "There's this moment," she said, gesturing with her fork, "when you're in the middle of a variation and everything just clicks. Your body knows exactly what to do without your brain having to think about it. And for those few minutes, You're not fighting gravity or technique or anything else. You're just flying. Julian found himself mesmerized by the way her face lit up when she talked about those moments of pure joy. This was the woman she was meant to be, passionate, articulate, glowing with an inner fire that no amount of control or restriction could completely extinguish. "That's how I feel when I'm designing," he said. "When all the pieces of a project come together and you can see exactly how it's supposed to be. Like you're not creating something new, just uncovering something that was always meant to exist." Their eyes met across the table, and Violet felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than attraction. They understood each other, she realized. They were both artists in their own way, both driven by the need to create something beautiful and lasting. When she finally set down her fork, she'd eaten more than half of the generous portion. The realization should have triggered panic, but instead she felt satisfied in a way she couldn't remember experiencing. "How do you feel?" Julian asked, reading her expression accurately. "Full," she said wonderingly. "Actually full. I'd forgotten what that felt like." "Good full or sick full?" "Good full," she admitted, surprising herself, "like my body is happy." Julian's smile was radiant with triumph and tenderness. "That's exactly how you should feel after every meal." As they prepared to leave, Violet glanced at her watch and gasped. It was nearly 6 o'clock. She'd been so absorbed in his company that she'd lost track of time completely. "I have to go," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "My mother will be furious if I'm late." Julian's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her mother, but he simply nodded and signaled for the check. As they walked back to his car, he caught her hand in his, the gesture now feeling natural and right. "Violet," he said as they reached the Bentley, "I want to see you again." "I want that too," she replied without hesitation, then blushed at her own boldness. Julian stepped closer, backing her gently against the car door. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and her lips parted in unconscious invitation, but instead, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the high arch of her cheekbones. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice low and intense. "I don't think you have any idea how beautiful you are." Before she could respond, before she could lose her courage, Violet rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing more than a whisper of contact, but it sent fire racing through both their veins. Julian's hands tightened on her face, and for a moment he kissed her back, deepening the contact just enough to make her gasp against his mouth. Then, with visible effort, he pulled back, resting his forehead against hers while they both caught their breath. "Not yet," he said raggedly. "Not until you're ready. Really ready." As he drove her home, Violet touched her lips, which still tingled from their brief contact with his. She didn't understand what he meant by really ready, but she knew without question that whatever was building between them was worth waiting for. And for the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe she might be worth waiting for too. Helena Mercer was waiting in the living room. When Violet walked through the door at exactly 6:15, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. The small apartment felt even more cramped than usual, with the weight of her mother's disapproval filling every corner. "You're late," Helena said, without looking up from the ballet magazine she was pretending to read. "Only by 15 minutes, Violet replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The taste of Julian's kiss still lingered on her lips, a secret warmth that she was terrified her mother might somehow detect. 15 minutes is 15 minutes too many. Where were you? Violet had prepared for this question during the car ride home, but now, faced with her mother's sharp green eyes, the practiced lie caught in her throat. "I stopped for coffee after rehearsal." "Coffee?" Helena's voice was flat, disbelieving. "Since when do you drink coffee?" "The caffeine will dehydrate you and the calories—" "It was black coffee," Violet interrupted, hating herself for the deception but knowing that the truth would be infinitely worse. Helena studied her daughter with the calculating gaze that had been analyzing her since birth, cataloguing every pound gained or lost, every sign of weakness or strength. Something was different about Violet tonight. There was a glow to her skin, a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "You look flushed," Helena observed. "Are you getting sick? We can't afford for you to miss any more rehearsals." "I'm fine, Mother, just tired." But Helena's maternal radar, finely tuned after years of managing every aspect of her daughter's life, was picking up signals that made her deeply uneasy. Violet was standing differently, with less of the careful precision that had been drilled into her since childhood. There was something almost relaxed about her posture. "Strip," Helena commanded suddenly. "What?" Violet's blood ran cold. "You heard me. I want to check your weight. Something's different about you tonight." The demand wasn't unusual. Helena had been monitoring Violet's body with obsessive attention for years, but tonight it felt like a violation in a way it never had before. The memory of Julian's hands on her face, the way he'd looked at her as if she were something precious and beautiful, made the idea of her mother's clinical inspection feel wrong. "I weighed myself this morning," Violet protested weakly. "I'm the same as always." "Now, Violet." There was no arguing with that tone. With shaking hands, Violet removed her street clothes, standing in her leotard and tights, while her mother circled her like a predator evaluating prey. "Your face is fuller," Helena observed, her voice taking on the sharp edge that had terrorized Violet since childhood. "And your thighs, they're getting soft. What have you been eating?" "Nothing different," Violet lied, but she could feel color rising in her cheeks. The pasta from dinner sat warm and satisfying in her stomach, the most substantial meal she'd had in months, and somehow she was certain her mother could detect it. Helena's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I can see the changes. Your body is getting complacent, which means you're getting complacent. Is this about that man from the hospital?" Violet's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Helena's smile was coldly triumphant. "I knew it. What did he tell you? That you were too thin? That you needed to eat more?" Helena's voice dripped with contempt. "Men like that don't understand what it takes to succeed in this business. They see a pretty face and think they can rescue you from your own ambitions." "It's not like that," Violet said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "It's exactly like that." Helena stepped closer, and Violet could smell the familiar scent of her mother's perfume, mixed with the bitter coffee she chain drank to suppress her own appetite. "Rich men collect beautiful women like trophies, Violet. They promise you the world, make you feel special, and then they get bored and move on to the next pretty thing that catches their eye." "You don't know him," Violet protested, but doubt was already creeping into her voice. Was Helena right? Was Julian just another wealthy man amusing himself with someone he saw as a charity case? "I know his type perfectly," Helena said with icy certainty. "Your father was exactly the same. Charming, successful, full of promises about how we'd be a family, right up until the moment I told him I was pregnant with you." The familiar story hit Violet like a physical blow, as it was intended to. Helena wielded the tale of abandonment and betrayal like a weapon, using it to explain why they could only depend on each other, why Violet's career was the only thing that mattered. "This is different," Violet said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Then where is he tonight? If he cares about you so much, why isn't he here fighting for you?" Helena's smile was cruel. "He's already gotten what he wanted, hasn't he? The thrill of rescuing the poor little dancer, maybe a few kisses to satisfy his ego. Now he'll disappear, and you'll be left with nothing except the extra weight you've gained from whatever he's been feeding you." Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and Violet felt them like physical wounds, because the terrible truth was that Helena might be right. What did she really know about Julian Ashford, except that he was wealthy and powerful and had seemed interested in helping her? What if this was all some elaborate game to him? "You're going back on the original diet plan," Helena continued, pressing her advantage. 800 calories, measured portions, daily weigh-ins. We need to undo whatever damage has been done before anyone else notices. "Mother, please." No arguments. Helena's voice was steel. "You have a performance tomorrow night, and you will not embarrass yourself or me by looking soft on that stage. Now go to your room and think about what you've risked with this foolishness." Alone in her childhood bedroom, Violet sat on her narrow bed and stared at Julian's business card, which she'd hidden in her jewelry box. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, each repetition making them seem more plausible, more true. What if he really was just amusing himself? What if the attention and kindness were just elaborate forms of pity? Meanwhile, across town, Julian was pacing his penthouse office like a caged wolf. The brief kiss they'd shared had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and the taste of her, sweet and tentative and absolutely perfect, lingered on his lips like a promise. But beneath his desire was a growing concern about what would happen when Helena Mercer realized her daughter was slipping away from her control. Julian had dealt with enough ruthless people in business to recognize the signs, and everything he'd learned about Violet's mother suggested she would not give up her hold without a fight. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, his investigator. Helena Mercer made several calls tonight, one to a lawyer, two to contacts at the ballet company. She's mobilizing. Julian's jaw clenched as he read the message. He'd expected this, but the speed of Helena's response was still concerning. Whatever she was planning, it would be designed to separate him from Violet as quickly and completely as possible. His phone rang and Julian answered without checking the caller ID, expecting it to be Marcus with more information. Julian. The voice was soft, uncertain, and achingly familiar. Violet. His entire body went rigid with attention. What's wrong? I can't do this. The words came out in a rush as if she'd been rehearsing them. I can't see you anymore, it's too complicated, and I need to focus on my career and… Violet, stop. Julian's voice was calm but commanding. Tell me what happened. What did she say to you? The use of she instead of your mother wasn't lost on Violet, and it made her chest tighten with something that might have been relief. He understood. He knew exactly who was behind this call. She's right, Violet whispered, but even as she said the words, they felt wrong on her tongue. I barely know you and you barely know me. This was all… It was just what? Julian's voice was gentle now, coaxing. Tell me what you really think, not what she told you to think. The distinction broke something open inside Violet, and she found herself crying. Silent tears that she wiped away with the back of her free hand. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know what's real anymore. She says you'll get bored and leave, and maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just being stupid and naive. Julian closed his eyes, recognizing the systematic destruction of self-worth that abusive people specialized in. Helena Mercer was more dangerous than he'd initially realized, not just controlling, but actively undermining her daughter's ability to trust her own judgment. Violet, listen to me very carefully, he said, his voice low and intense. I am not going anywhere. I am not playing games with you, and you are not stupid or naive. You're a remarkable woman who has been told lies about herself for so long that you've started to believe them. But what if… No what ifs, Julian interrupted firmly. What if we focus on what we know instead of what we fear? We know that you felt safe with me. We know that you enjoyed dinner tonight. We know that when I kissed you it felt right. Am I wrong about any of that? No, she whispered. Then trust that. Trust what you felt, instead of what you've been told to feel. There was a long silence on the line, and Julian held his breath, knowing that this moment would determine everything that followed. I have a performance tomorrow night, Violet said finally. The fall gala at Lincoln Center. I know, I already have tickets. You do? The surprise in her voice was genuine. I've had them for a week, Julian admitted. I wanted to see you dance. To see you in your element, doing what you love. The simple statement hit Violet like a revelation. When had anyone last come to see her perform because they wanted to celebrate her talent rather than evaluate her technique? When had anyone shown interest in her art rather than her adherence to arbitrary standards of perfection? I'll be in the third row center section, Julian continued, and afterward, I'll be at the stage door waiting. Whether you come with me or not is your choice, but I'll be there either way. After she hung up, Violet lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, her mother's words and Julian's promises warring in her mind. Tomorrow night's performance would be more than just another show. It would be a choice between the life she'd always known and the possibility of something she'd never dared to dream. In his penthouse, Julian stood at the window overlooking the city lights, his hands clenched at his sides. Tomorrow night, he would watch the woman he was falling in love with dance on one of the world's most prestigious stages, and then he would find out whether she was brave enough to choose happiness over fear. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure, because he was beginning to realize that his own happiness now depended entirely on her answer. The Lincoln Center Plaza buzzed with pre-performance energy, as New York's cultural elite arrived for the fall gala in their finest evening wear. Julian adjusted his black tuxedo tie for the third time, uncharacteristically nervous as he made his way through the crowd toward the David H. Koch Theater. He'd attended countless high-profile events in his role as one of Manhattan's most successful developers, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't here as Julian Ashford, businessman. He was here as a man who had spent the entire day thinking about a woman with whiskey-colored eyes and a smile that could illuminate the darkness in his soul. Inside the theater, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Julian took his seat in the third row, exactly where he'd promised Violet he would be, and studied the program with hands that were steadier than his pulse. Her name appeared in elegant script, Violet Mercer, as Odette Odile, in excerpts from Swan Lake, the lead role. She was dancing the lead. Julian felt a surge of pride that was entirely disproportionate to his actual role in her life, followed immediately by a twist of anxiety. The pressure she must be feeling tonight, performing one of ballet's most demanding roles while dealing with the emotional turmoil of the last 24 hours. The lights dimmed, and Julian's concerns evaporated as the curtain rose on a scene of ethereal beauty. The corps de ballet moved like a flock of actual swans, their white tutus catching the stage lights as they created a living landscape of grace and precision. And then Violet appeared. Julian's breath caught in his throat as she glided onto the stage, every line of her body expressing the tragic beauty of the Swan Queen. The weeks of additional nutrition had given her a luminescence that the stage lights seemed to magnify, and she moved with a power and fluidity that commanded absolute attention. This is what she was born to do, he realized, as she began her first variation. Every movement was perfection, but more than that, it was storytelling. Through her body, she was narrating a tale of love and betrayal, of transformation and loss that reached into the audience and squeezed hearts with invisible hands. But Julian found himself watching more than her technique. He was watching her face, and what he saw there made his chest tighten with emotion. This wasn't just a performance for Violet. It was an escape. On this stage, she could be powerful and tragic and beautiful, without anyone weighing her worth in pounds or calories. Here she was exactly what she was meant to be. Backstage, Helena Mercer watched from the wings with the calculating gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. She had been part of this world long enough to read an audience, and the collective intake of breath when Violet appeared told her everything she needed to know. Her daughter was transcendent tonight, elevated by whatever emotional turbulence she was experiencing into something approaching artistry rather than mere technical competence. Good, Helena thought grimly. Let her get it out of her system here. Tomorrow, we'll deal with the reality of what needs to be done. Helena had spent the day making phone calls, pulling strings and positioning pieces on the chessboard of her daughter's career. The lawyer had been very clear about the legal implications of a wealthy older man pursuing a young woman who was financially dependent on her family. The contacts at the ballet company had been even more helpful, providing information about upcoming casting decisions that could make or break Violet's ascent to principal dancer. By the end of the week, Helena was confident that Julian Ashford would be nothing more than a footnote in her daughter's story. As the first act concluded to thunderous applause, Julian found himself on his feet with the rest of the audience, his hands coming together in appreciation that was both professional and deeply personal. Violet had been magnificent, not just technically perfect, but emotionally present in a way that elevated everyone around her. During intermission, Julian remained in his seat while other patrons moved to the lobby for champagne and conversation. He pulled out his phone and typed a simple message. "You are extraordinary. Every person in this theater can see it." He hesitated for only a moment before hitting send, knowing she wouldn't see it until after the performance, but hoping that somehow the knowledge that he was there, that he was proud of her, would reach her anyway. Backstage, Violet was going through the ritual preparations for the second act when her phone chimed with Julian's message. She read it twice, 3 times, feeling tears threaten her carefully applied stage makeup. "Focus, darling," her mother said sharply, appearing beside her dressing room chair with the predatory grace that had terrorized Violet throughout her childhood. "Whatever distractions you're entertaining in your head, put them aside. The second act is where reputations are made or broken." "I know, Mother," Violet replied. But for once, Helena's words didn't have their usual power to reduce her to anxious compliance. Julian's message glowed on her phone screen like a talisman, a reminder that she was more than just a collection of technical achievements and physical measurements. The second act opened with the ballroom scene, where Prince Siegfried would be deceived by the Black Swan Odile into believing she was his beloved Odette. It was a role that required not just technical mastery, but the ability to portray seduction and manipulation with convincing authority. As the curtain rose again, Julian leaned forward in his seat, entirely absorbed in the drama unfolding on stage. When Violet appeared as Odile, transformed by black tutus and dramatic makeup into the Swan Queen's dark mirror, he felt his pulse quicken with something that was definitely not appropriate for a public venue. The Black Swan was confidence personified, every movement designed to captivate and ensnare. Violet's portrayal was mesmerizing. She moved with a sensuality and power that seemed to come from some deep well of newfound self-awareness. As she executed the famous 32 fouettes, spinning with dizzying precision while maintaining perfect control, Julian found himself gripping the arms of his seat. "She's incredible," he thought, watching her command the stage with an authority that took his breath away. "She's absolutely incredible, and she has no idea." The thought of Helena Mercer systematically destroying this magnificent creature's self-worth made Julian's jaw clench with fury, but he forced himself to focus on the performance, on celebrating what Violet was achieving in this moment. As the final tragic scenes unfolded, the revelation of Odile's deception, Odette's despair, the prince's realization that he had been betrayed, Julian felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. The emotion Violet brought to these final moments was raw and real, as if she was pouring her own pain and confusion into the role. When the curtain fell to a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever, Julian remained on his feet, applauding until his hands stung. Around him, the audience was buzzing with the electricity that followed truly exceptional performances. "Magnificent," he heard a woman behind him saying. "Absolutely magnificent. She'll be a principal within the year." "Did you see those turns?" her companion replied. "Flawless. And the emotion she brought to the death scene, I've never seen it performed with such authenticity." Julian felt a fierce surge of pride and protectiveness. They were talking about his Violet, not that she was his, but the possessive thought came naturally unbidden. She had been sublime tonight, and everyone in the theatre knew it. As the audience began filing out, Julian remained in his seat, checking his watch. 20 minutes until the stage door would open, and he would find out whether Violet had the courage to choose him over the life of careful restriction and emotional manipulation that Helena Mercer had constructed around her. Backstage, Violet was surrounded by congratulations and flowers, but she barely heard the praise being heaped on her. Her heart was pounding with something that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the performance, and everything to do with the knowledge that Julian was somewhere in the theatre, that he had watched her pour her heart out on that stage. "Exceptional work tonight, darling," Helena said, appearing at her elbow with a bouquet of white roses. "The Times critic was here, and I saw him taking notes during your variations. This could be the review that changes everything for you." "Thank you, Mother," Violet replied automatically, but her attention was on her phone, on Julian's message, on the choice she knew she had to make. "There will be a reception at the Russian tea room afterward," Helena continued, her voice carrying that familiar note of command disguised as suggestion. "All the board members will be there, and this is the perfect opportunity to solidify the impression you made tonight." "Actually, Mother," Violet said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "I think I'm going to skip the reception tonight. I'm exhausted, and I want to get some rest." Helena's eyes narrowed. "This is not the time for rest, Violet. This is the time to capitalize on your success. You can rest when you're a principal dancer." "And what if I don't want to be a principal dancer?" The question came out before Violet could stop it, and she saw Helena's face go white with shock. "Don't be ridiculous," Helena said sharply. "Of course you want to be a principal dancer. It's what we've worked for your entire life." "It's what you've worked for," Violet replied quietly, and the distinction felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. "I'm not sure it's what I want anymore." The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Violet could see the moment when her mother's shock transformed into cold fury. "Go to your dressing room," Helena said in a voice that could have frozen flames. "We'll discuss this when you're thinking clearly." But as Violet walked away, she realized with crystalline clarity that she was thinking more clearly than she had in years. Tonight, on that stage, She had remembered who she was beneath all the layers of expectation and control. She had remembered that she was powerful, that she was beautiful, that she had choices. And one of those choices was waiting for her at the stage door. 15 minutes later, Julian stood outside the theatre in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his breath visible in the cool October air as he watched the stage door with the intensity of a man whose entire future depended on what emerged from it. When Violet finally appeared, still in her stage makeup but wearing street clothes, Julian felt his heart stop and restart in his chest. She looked around the crowd of waiting fans and photographers until her eyes found his, and the smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. She walked toward him as if she were still floating across the stage, and when she reached him, Julian cupped her face in his hands exactly as he had the night before. "You were transcendent," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely transcendent." "I could feel you watching me," she replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It made me feel powerful." "You are powerful," Julian said fiercely. "You always have been. Tonight, you just let everyone else see it." As they stood there in the glow of the theatre lights, surrounded by the bustle of post-performance excitement, Violet made her choice. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, right there in front of anyone who cared to look, claiming him as publicly as he had been claiming her in his heart for weeks. This time, Julian didn't pull away. This time, he kissed her back with all the passion and tenderness he'd been holding in check, his hands tangling in her hair as he showed her without words exactly how extraordinary he found her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Violet smiled up at him with a boldness that would have been impossible just hours before. "Take me home," she said softly. "Not to my mother's apartment. Take me to your home." Julian searched her eyes, making sure she understood what she was asking for, what she was choosing. When he saw only determination and growing desire, he took her hand and led her toward his waiting car. Neither of them noticed Helena Mercer watching from the theatre entrance, her face a mask of cold calculation as she pulled out her phone to make a call that would change everything. Julian's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. As the private elevator opened directly into the living space, Violet felt her breath catch at the understated elegance surrounding her. The space was quintessentially masculine but not cold, exposed brick walls softened by carefully chosen artwork, leather furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable, and warm lighting that made everything glow with golden intimacy. It was sophisticated without being intimidating, powerful without being ostentatious. "It's beautiful," she said softly, still holding Julian's hand as he led her into the main living area. "It's home," he replied simply, but Violet could hear the pride underneath. "Can I get you something? Wine, tea? Are you hungry?" The last question made her pause. After a performance like tonight's, she would normally be surviving on adrenaline and whatever minimal sustenance her mother deemed appropriate. But standing here in Julian's space, still glowing from his praise and the memory of his kiss, she realized she was actually hungry. "I could eat," she admitted, surprising herself. Julian's smile was radiant with approval and something deeper, relief perhaps that she was beginning to trust her body's signals again. "Let me cook for you," he said, leading her toward the open kitchen that occupied one corner of the loft. "Nothing elaborate, I'm not much of a chef, but I make decent pasta and I have some good wine." Violet found herself settling onto one of the leather bar stools that faced the kitchen island, watching Julian move with economical grace as he gathered ingredients. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms that were corded with lean muscle. Everything about him spoke of controlled strength, but there was something almost domestic about seeing him in his own kitchen. "Tell me about tonight," he said as he opened a bottle of Chianti, pouring her a glass of wine the color of garnets. "How did it feel up there?" Violet took a sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "Like flying," she said simply, "but also like I was telling my own story for the first time instead of just performing someone else's choreography." Julian paused in his preparation of garlic and herbs, giving her his complete attention. "What story were you telling?" The question made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I don't know exactly. Something about being trapped, about wanting to be free, but being afraid of what freedom might cost." She looked up at him, vulnerability naked in her eyes. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Julian said softly, moving around the island to stand beside her stool. He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "And what did you decide? About what freedom might cost?" "That it's worth it," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "Whatever it costs, it's worth it." The words hung between them, weighted with promise and possibility. Julian felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this moment was pivotal, not just for Violet's journey toward independence, but for his own journey toward something he'd never thought he'd find again. He kissed her then, softly at first, then with growing intensity as she responded with a passion that matched his own. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and when they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "The pasta," Julian said roughly, though he made no move to step away from her. "Can wait," Violet finished, rising from her stool so that she was pressed against him from chest to knee. "Julian, I haven't—" "I know," he said gently, understanding what she was trying to tell him without making her say it explicitly. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for." "But I am ready," she said with a certainty that surprised them both. "For the first time in my life, I know what I want, and I want you." Julian searched her eyes, looking for any trace of doubt or fear, but found only growing desire and a determination that took his breath away. This was the real Violet, the one who had been hidden beneath years of control and manipulation. Strong, sensual, unafraid to claim what she wanted. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse with restraint. Instead of answering with words, Violet reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt with fingers that trembled only slightly. Julian caught her hands gently, stilling her movements. "Not here," he said softly. "You deserve better than a kitchen counter for your first time." He lifted her easily, carrying her through the loft toward his bedroom, and Violet felt her heart swell with tenderness at his consideration. This was what she had been missing her entire life, someone who saw her as precious, as worthy of care and reverence. Julian's bedroom was as elegantly masculine as the rest of the space, dominated by a king-sized bed with crisp white linens and a view of the city lights through tall windows. He set her down gently beside the bed, his hands resting on her waist as he looked down at her with an expression that made her knees weak. "You're trembling," he observed gently. "Good trembling," she assured him, rising up to kiss him again. "Julian, I need you to know this isn't just about tonight. This isn't just physical for me." "For me either," he said roughly, his hands tangling in her hair. "Violet, I'm falling in love with you. Hell, I think I've been in love with you since that first night when you fell into my arms." The confession hit her like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was everything she'd hoped for and been afraid to believe. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I love your strength and your gentleness, and the way you make me feel like I'm worth protecting." "You are worth protecting," Julian said fiercely, his blue eyes blazing with emotion. "You're worth everything." As they moved together toward the bed, Violet felt the last of her fears fall away. In Julian's arms, she was safe to be vulnerable, safe to discover who she was beneath all the layers of control and expectation that had defined her for so long. Outside the bedroom windows, Manhattan sparkled like a jeweled tapestry, but neither of them noticed. They were too absorbed in each other, in the careful reverence of first discoveries, in the growing certainty that they had found something worth fighting for. In the distance, Violet's phone buzzed with increasingly frantic calls from Helena, but the sound was lost in the whispered endearments and gentle promises that filled the quiet sanctuary Julian had created for them. Tonight, the outside world could wait. Tonight, there was only love, trust, and the beautiful beginning of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Violet woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the intoxicating scent of sandalwood that had become synonymous with safety in her mind. For a moment she lay perfectly still, processing the unfamiliar weight of Julian's arm around her waist, the warmth of his body pressed against her back, the delicious soreness that reminded her of everything they had discovered together in the quiet hours before dawn. She had never imagined it could be like that, so gentle and fierce simultaneously, so consuming, yet so reverent. Julian had worshipped her body with the same attention to detail he brought to his architectural projects, learning every curve and hollow, until she felt completely known, completely claimed. Good morning, beautiful. Julian's voice was rough with sleep against her ear, sending shivers down her spine. Violet turned in his arms, marveling at how right it felt to wake up beside him, how natural it seemed to trace the strong line of his jaw with her fingertips. Good morning, she replied softly, then paused as reality began to intrude on their perfect bubble. What time is it? Julian glanced at the bedside clock, and she saw his expression tighten slightly. Almost 11. 11 o'clock. Violet's breath caught as the implications hit her. She was supposed to have been home by midnight at the latest, and her phone, which she could now hear buzzing insistently from somewhere in the living room, had probably been ringing for hours. My mother, she said, sitting up abruptly, the sheet clutched to her chest. She's going to be furious. She's going to... Hey! Julian sat up beside her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Look at me, Violet. She turned to face him, seeing concern and something fiercer in his storm blue eyes. You are 22 years old, he said quietly but firmly. You are not required to report your whereabouts to anyone. You spent the night with a man who loves you, in a place where you were safe and cherished. There is nothing wrong with that. Violet felt some of the panic recede at his words, but years of conditioning weren't easily overcome. You don't understand. When she gets like this, when she feels like she's losing control, then maybe it's time she learned that she never had control to begin with, Julian said, his voice hardening slightly. Violet, what happened between us last night? That was your choice, your decision. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of it. Before she could respond, the distant sound of her phone ringing filled the silence again. Julian's jaw tightened as he recognized the manipulation in the relentless calls. I should answer it, Violet said reluctantly, just to let her know I'm safe. If that's what you want, Julian agreed, though she could see in his eyes that he thought it was a mistake. But remember, you don't owe her an explanation or an apology for living your life. Violet retrieved her phone from the living room, returning to find Julian pulling on a pair of dark jeans that sat low on his lean hips. The sight of his bare chest, marked with faint scratches from her nails, sent heat spiraling through her body despite her anxiety. Helena answered on the first ring, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Where the hell are you, Violet? I'm safe, Mother. I stayed with a friend. Don't lie to me. Helena's voice rose to a dangerous pitch. I know exactly where you are and who you're with. Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage you've caused? Violet felt her newfound confidence wavering under the familiar assault. I don't know what you mean. The Times critic saw you leaving with that man, Helena continued remorselessly. There are already whispers about your dedication to your craft. Do you think principal dancers are chosen based on their talent alone? Reputation matters, Violet. Respectability matters. Mother, that's not... Come home, now. We need to do damage control before this gets any worse. The line went dead, leaving Violet staring at her phone with shaking hands. Julian, who had been listening with a darkening expression, crossed the room and gently took the phone from her hands. She's lying, he said simply. About the critic, about the damage to your reputation. She's trying to manipulate you into feeling guilty for being happy. But what if she's not lying? Violet's voice was small, uncertain. What if this really does hurt my career? Julian cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Then your career isn't worth having. Violet, any institution that would punish you for having a personal life, for being in love, for making your own choices, that's not somewhere you want to be. The words were logical, but 20 years of conditioning made them hard to accept. Violet felt torn between the new world Julian was offering her and the familiar, if painful, certainty of her mother's control. I should go home, she said finally. Just to talk to her, to try to explain... No! Julian's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Violet, think about what you're saying. You want to go back and explain to your abuser why you chose to be happy for one night. The word abuser hit her like a physical blow. She's my mother. She sacrificed everything for my career. She sacrificed everything for her own unfulfilled dreams, Julian corrected firmly, and she's been using guilt and fear to trap you in a life that's slowly killing you. That's abuse, Violet, regardless of her motivations. Violet stared at him, processing his words alongside everything she had learned about herself in the past few weeks. The way her body had responded to proper nutrition, the joy she had felt dancing last night when she wasn't worried about her mother's evaluation. the sense of rightness she felt in Julian's arms. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is all happening so fast, and I need to figure out what I really want." Julian's expression gentled, though she could see the frustration he was trying to hide. "Of course, but Violet, don't go back to that apartment alone. If you need to face her, let me come with you." "That would make everything worse," Violet said, though part of her desperately wanted his protection. "She already sees you as a threat. If you show up, then what? She'll cut off your allowance? Stop paying for your dance classes?" Julian's voice was challenging, but not unkind. "Violet, you're talented enough to earn your own living. You don't have to depend on her approval or her financial support." The conversation was interrupted by the buzzing of the apartment's intercom. Julian frowned, moving to the panel near the elevator. "Mr. Ashford," the doorman's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's a Helena Mercer here to see you. She says it's urgent." Violet's face went white. She came here. She actually came here. Julian's expression was thunderous as he looked at Violet's obvious distress. "Send her up," he said into the intercom, then turned to Violet with deadly calm. "Get dressed. It's time to end this." "Julian, you don't understand what she's capable of. Neither does she," Julian replied grimly, pulling on a shirt with sharp, angry movements. "But she's about to find out exactly what I'm capable of when someone threatens the woman I love." As the elevator hummed its way up to the penthouse, Violet dressed quickly in last night's clothes, her hands shaking with anxiety. She had never seen Julian angry before. Controlled, yes. Intense, certainly. But this was different. This was protective fury, and she wasn't sure whether it terrified or thrilled her. The elevator doors opened to reveal Helena Mercer, in all her cold perfection. Designer suit, flawless makeup, and eyes like green ice as she surveyed Julian's apartment with obvious distaste. "So," she said without preamble, her gaze moving between Julian and Violet, with calculated cruelty. "This is where my daughter spent the night playing house with her latest patron." Julian stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Violet, and Helena's eyes sharpened with interest. She had expected anger, but the controlled menace radiating from this man was something else entirely. "Mrs. Mercer," Julian said, his voice perfectly polite and absolutely lethal. "How nice to finally meet the woman who's been slowly destroying her daughter for the past 20 years. Helena's smile was razor-sharp. "Mr. Ashford, I've been looking forward to this conversation." As the two most important people in Violet's life faced off in the morning sunlight streaming through Julian's windows, she realized that whatever happened next would determine the course of her entire future. The battle for her soul was about to begin. The tension in Julian's penthouse was so thick, it seemed to vibrate in the air between the three figures standing in the morning light. Helena Mercer moved through the space like a predator evaluating territory, her calculating gaze taking in every detail of the luxurious apartment before settling on her daughter with cold disapproval. "Violet, darling," Helena's voice dripped with false sweetness, "you look different. I hope you're not getting too comfortable with this lifestyle. We both know how quickly men like Mr. Ashford lose interest once the novelty wears off." Julian felt every muscle in his body tense at the deliberate cruelty in Helena's tone, but it was Violet's small intake of breath, the way she seemed to physically shrink under her mother's attention, that made his vision edge with red. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice controlled but dangerous, "I think you should be very careful about what you say next." Helena's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Oh, how charming! The knight in shining armor routine. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, how many young women have you rescued over the years? How many naive girls have you convinced that you were their salvation?" "Mother, stop," Violet said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. The poison Helena was spreading was already taking root, feeding every insecurity that had been planted and cultivated over years of systematic manipulation. "I'm simply looking out for your best interests, darling," Helena continued, moving closer to her daughter with predatory grace. "Men like him don't marry girls like you. They play with them for a while, maybe set them up in a nice apartment, and then they move on to the next pretty thing that catches their eye." Julian watched Violet's face, seeing the doubt creeping into her expression, and felt something crack inside his chest. This was exactly what Helena had intended, to poison the beautiful thing they had built together, to make Violet question everything she had felt in his arms. "Actually," Julian said, his voice cutting through Helena's manipulations like a blade, "I was planning to ask Violet to marry me." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Helena's face went white with shock, while Violet stared at Julian with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You were?" Violet whispered, and Julian could hear the hope and terror warring in her voice. "I was," Julian confirmed, moving to stand beside her, his hand finding hers despite Helena's presence. "I am." "Violet, I know this isn't how I planned to do this, but I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you, cherishing you, helping you become everything you're meant to be." Helena recovered her composure with frightening speed, her expression shifting from shock to cold calculation. "How romantic," she said acidly. "But tell me, Mr. Ashford, what exactly do you know about my daughter's medical history?" Julian felt Violet's hand tighten in his, saw the flash of panic in her eyes, and knew immediately that Helena was about to deploy her most devastating weapon. "I know that you've been systematically starving her," Julian replied flatly. "I know that she collapsed from malnutrition, and that you convinced her it was normal. I know that you've been using food as a weapon of control for years." "Did she tell you about her eating disorder?" Helena's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "Did she mention that she's been in and out of treatment facilities since she was 16? That she has a documented history of self-destructive behavior?" Julian felt the blood drain from his face as he turned to look at Violet, who had gone deathly pale. "Violet, it's not what she's making it sound like," Violet said desperately. "The treatment facilities were her idea. When I tried to eat more, she said I was being compulsive, that I needed help. She's been lying to you," Helena continued remorselessly, pulling a folder from her expensive handbag. "Medical records, treatment reports, psychiatric evaluations. She's not the innocent victim she's pretending to be, Mr. Ashford. She's sick, and she's manipulative, and she will destroy your life the way she's destroyed everything else she's touched." The papers Helena was brandishing might as well have been weapons for the devastation they caused. Julian saw the way Violet seemed to fold in on herself, saw 20 years of gaslighting and psychological abuse crystallize into this moment of ultimate betrayal. "That's enough." Julian's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of tone that had made boardrooms fall silent and grown men reconsider their life choices. "Mrs. Mercer, I want you to leave. Now." "Oh, I don't think so." Helena's smile was triumphant. "You see, Violet is still financially dependent on me. Her apartment, her living expenses, her career, all of it flows through me. If she chooses to continue this association with you, she loses everything." "Then she'll have me," Julian said simply. But he could see that Violet was drowning in her mother's poison, unable to distinguish between truth and manipulation. "Will she?" Helena's voice was soft, deadly. "Or will you decide you can't handle the complexity of her issues? Will you realize that loving someone with her problems is more work than you're willing to take on?" Julian looked at Violet, seeing the terror in her eyes, the absolute certainty that Helena's words were prophecy rather than manipulation. Years of being told she was broken, difficult, too much to handle, had carved those beliefs so deeply into her psyche that his love alone couldn't erase them. "Violet," he said gently, ignoring Helena entirely, "look at me." Reluctantly, Violet raised her eyes to meet his, and Julian felt his heart break at the pain he saw there. "I don't care," he said simply. "Whatever she's told you about yourself, whatever lies are in those files, whatever she thinks is wrong with you, I don't care. I love you, all of you, even the parts you think are broken." "You don't understand," Violet whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's right. I am too much. I am broken. Everyone leaves eventually when they realize how much work I am." "Everyone except me," Julian said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands. "Violet, I have spent my entire adult life building things that last. I don't give up on projects that matter to me, and you matter more than anything else in the world." Helena watched this exchange with growing fury, realizing that her psychological weapons were being neutralized by Julian's unwavering certainty. "Time for a different strategy." "How touching," she said coldly. "But there's something else you should know, Mr. Ashford, about your own history, about your wife." Julian went rigid, his hands dropping from Violet's face as he turned to face Helena with an expression that would have terrified anyone with sense. "What about my wife?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you tell Violet how she died?" Helena's smile was cruel as a blade. "How she was driving away from your house in a snowstorm because you'd had a fight. How she crashed on those icy mountain roads trying to get away from you." The words hit Julian like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Beside him, he felt Violet stiffen with shock. "You see, darling," Helena continued to Violet, "Mr. Ashford has a pattern. Women who love him end up dead. Are you really willing to risk becoming the next tragic accident in his life?" The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stood frozen, the old guilt and self-recrimination flooding back with devastating force. He had spent years in therapy learning to process Sarah's death, to understand that her decision to drive in dangerous conditions wasn't his fault. But Helena's words stripped away all that hard-won peace. Violet looked between Julian and her mother, seeing the devastation in Julian's eyes, the triumph in Helena's, and felt something inside her chest shatter completely. "I need to think," she whispered, backing toward the elevator. I can't do this right now." "Violet, wait." Julian started forward, but she shook her head desperately. "No, I need space. I need time to figure out what's real." She looked at him with eyes full of love and terror in equal measure. "I'm sorry, Julian. I'm so sorry." As the elevator doors closed on Violet's tear-stained face, Helena turned to Julian with satisfied malice. "You really thought you could save her?" she asked mockingly. "She's been broken since she was a child, Mr. Ashford, and broken people break everything they touch." Julian stared at the closed elevator doors, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for the first time since he'd caught Violet falling in that restaurant, he wondered if Helena might be right. The woman he loved was disappearing from his life, taking his heart with her, and he had no idea how to fight an enemy who lived inside the mind of the person he was trying to protect. 3 weeks passed in a haze of misery for both Julian and Violet, though they experienced their separation in vastly different ways. Julian threw himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He arrived at construction sites before dawn and stayed at his office until well past midnight, pushing his body to exhaustion in the hope that physical fatigue might quiet the ache in his chest. His assistant learned not to mention lunch meetings, having watched him stare at untouched food while his mind wandered to a woman with whiskey-colored eyes who had briefly made him believe in happily ever after. But the work provided no escape. Every building he designed reminded him of creating something beautiful and lasting, which reminded him of the future he had envisioned with Violet. Every young couple he saw walking hand in hand was a knife twist of what he had lost. Every sunset over Manhattan made him remember the night she had danced like an angel and then chosen to trust him with her heart. Meanwhile, Violet had returned to Helena's apartment like a wounded animal seeking its den, only to discover that the den had become a prison. Helena, sensing victory, had tightened her control with surgical precision. The 800-calorie diet was reinstated with religious fervor, daily weigh-ins became mandatory, and Violet's schedule was managed down to the minute to prevent any possibility of distraction. "You see how much better you feel without all that emotional chaos," Helena would say, as she measured out exactly 4 ounces of grilled chicken for Violet's dinner. "Artists need discipline, darling. We need structure. That man was making you soft." But Violet didn't feel better. She felt hollow, as if something vital had been carved out of her chest and left a gaping wound in its place. The additional weight she had gained during those precious weeks with Julian melted away with frightening speed, leaving her once again sharp-angled and fragile. Her dancing, which had soared to new heights during her time with Julian, became mechanical again, technically perfect but emotionally vacant. Her fellow dancers noticed the change immediately. "You look tired, Vi," her friend Carmen observed after a particularly lifeless rehearsal. "Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine," Violet replied automatically, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. Because she wasn't fine. She was disappearing again, piece by piece, day by day, until she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The worst part was the dreams. Every night she dreamed of Julian, his hands on her face, his voice telling her she was extraordinary, the way he had made love to her with such reverent tenderness. She would wake to find tear tracks on her cheeks and Helena standing in the doorway, watching her with cold satisfaction. "Still dreaming about him?" Helena would ask with false sympathy. "It will pass, darling. These infatuations always do." But it wasn't passing. If anything, the ache in Violet's chest grew stronger with each day, fed by the growing certainty that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Julian's face haunted her. Not just the desire and love she remembered, but the devastation in his eyes when Helena had weaponized his wife's death against him. "He must hate me now," she thought, as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, counting ribs that were once again becoming visible. "He must think I'm exactly what she said I was. Broken, manipulative, not worth fighting for." The thought was unbearable, but not as unbearable as the alternative. That he might still love her, might still be waiting for her to find the courage to choose him over fear. Julian, meanwhile, was wrestling with demons of his own. Helena's words had reopened wounds he'd thought were healed, forcing him to confront the guilt he'd carried since Sarah's death. Had he driven his wife away with his single-minded focus on work? Had his need to protect and control contributed to the tragedy that followed? Maybe Helena was right, he thought during another sleepless night in his empty penthouse. Maybe I do destroy the women I love. Maybe Violet is better off without me. But even as the thought formed, he rejected it with fierce determination. Because Violet wasn't Sarah, and he wasn't the same man he'd been 8 years ago. He had learned from his mistakes, grown from his grief, and what he felt for Violet was deeper and more mature than anything he'd experienced before. The breaking point came when Julian's investigator, Marcus, called with information that made his blood run cold. "Julian, you need to see this." Marcus's voice was grim. "I've been tracking Helena Mercer's finances, and there's something you need to know. She's been embezzling from Violet's performance fees and endorsement deals for years." Julian's grip tightened on his phone. "How much?" "Close to $200,000, maybe more. The girl should be financially independent by now, but Helena's been siphoning off her earnings and telling her they need to be carefully managed." The revelation hit Julian like a physical blow. Helena's control over Violet wasn't just psychological, it was financial theft, pure and simple. She had stolen her daughter's independence along with her self-worth, ensuring that escape would seem impossible. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I also found records of those treatment facilities Helena mentioned. Violet was never diagnosed with an eating disorder by any legitimate medical professional. The facilities were expensive spas that Helena claimed were medical treatment while pocketing the insurance money." Julian closed his eyes, feeling rage and vindication war in his chest. Helena hadn't just been controlling Violet. She had been systematically defrauding her, creating a web of lies so complex that her daughter couldn't distinguish between truth and manipulation. "I need copies of everything," Julian said grimly. "Every document, every financial record, every piece of evidence you can find." "Julian," Marcus's voice was cautious, "what are you planning?" "I'm planning to give Violet the truth," Julian replied, his voice hard with determination. "And then I'm going to destroy the woman who's been destroying her." That same evening, as autumn rain lashed against the windows of Helena's apartment, Violet sat at the kitchen table, picking at the meager salad that constituted her dinner. Her mother was across from her, reading ballet magazines and making occasional comments about dancers who had let themselves go. "Amanda Torres gained at least 10 pounds this season," Helena observed with cold satisfaction. "You can see it in her arms during the Porte de Bras. She'll never make principal now." Violet nodded absently, but her attention was caught by the sound of the apartment building's buzzer. Helena frowned, glancing at the clock. "We're not expecting anyone," she said, moving to the intercom. "Yes?" "Mrs. Mercer, this is Julian Ashford. I need to speak with you and Violet. It's urgent." Helena's face went white, then mottled red with fury. "We have nothing to say to you, Mr. Ashford. I suggest you—" "I have information about your financial fraud." Julian's voice cut through her protests like a blade. "Medical records that prove you've been lying about Violet's treatment history. Bank statements that show exactly how much money you've stolen from your daughter over the years." The silence that followed was deafening. Helena stared at the intercom as if it were a snake, while Violet looked between her mother and the speaker with growing confusion and dawning horror. "What is he talking about?" Violet asked quietly. Before Helena could answer, Julian's voice filled the small kitchen again. But now he was speaking directly to Violet, his tone gentle despite the circumstances. "Violet, I know you're listening. I know you're probably scared and confused, but I need you to hear this. Everything she told you about yourself, about your medical history, about being broken, it was all lies. You were never sick, Violet. You were never the problem. She was." Violet felt the world tilt around her as Julian's words penetrated the fog of manipulation that had surrounded her for weeks. Helena was moving toward the intercom, probably to cut off the connection, but Julian's voice continued with urgent intensity. "She's been stealing from you, Violet. Your performance fees, your endorsement money, hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have been yours. You could have been independent years ago, but she made sure you never knew that was an option." "He's lying," Helena said sharply, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "He's desperate, trying to manipulate you." "Then let me show you the proof." Julian's voice was calm, implacable. "Let me come up and show you exactly what she's been doing. Or better yet, come down and see for yourself. My car is outside. You can look at the documents and decide for yourself what's true." Violet stared at her mother, seeing something she'd never noticed before. The flicker of panic in Helena's eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she gripped the intercom. "You're not going anywhere," Helena said firmly. But for the first time in her life, her command didn't carry its usual weight. Because Violet was remembering things, small inconsistencies in her mother's stories, questions about money that had never been answered, the way Helena had always handled every financial aspect of her career while claiming it was too complicated for Violet to understand. "I'm going down," Violet said quietly, standing from the table on unsteady legs. "Violet." "No." Helena's voice was sharp with desperation. "You can't trust him. He'll fill your head with lies, make you believe—" "Believe what?" Violet turned to face her mother fully, and Helena took an involuntary step backward at the expression in her daughter's eyes. "Believe that I'm worth something. Believe that I deserve to be treated with respect. Believe that I'm not broken." "You are broken," Helena said viciously, her careful mask finally slipping completely. "You've always been broken. Without me, you're nothing. Without me managing your career, controlling your diet, making your decisions, you would have destroyed yourself years ago." The words hung in the air between them, and Violet felt the last chains of manipulation snap in her mind. This was what Julian had been trying to show her, that Helena's love was conditional, controlling, designed to keep her small and dependent rather than help her grow. "Maybe," Violet said softly, moving toward the door. "But I'd rather destroy myself making my own choices than let you destroy me making yours." As she reached for the doorknob, Helena's voice rose to a shriek behind her. "If you leave now, don't bother coming back. If you choose him over me, you're no daughter of mine." Violet paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and turned back to look at the woman who had shaped every day of her life since birth. "Then I guess I'm not your daughter anymore," she said simply, and walked out of the apartment into the rest of her life. The rain was falling harder now, turning the October evening into a blur of grey and gold streetlights. Violet stood on the sidewalk outside her mother's building, soaked to the skin within seconds, staring at Julian's Bentley idling at the curb. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she could see his silhouette, broad shoulders tense with waiting, hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were an anchor. "He came for me," she thought wonderingly. "After everything that happened, after the way I ran, he came for me." Julian must have seen her emerge from the building because the passenger door opened immediately, warm light spilling onto the wet pavement. He stepped out into the rain without regard for his expensive suit, moving toward her with long, purposeful strides. When he reached her, they both stopped, suddenly uncertain. 3 weeks of separation stretched between them like a chasm, filled with hurt and misunderstanding and the poison Helena had injected into their perfect beginning. "Violet," Julian's voice was rough with emotion, his dark hair already wet from the rain. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, and then the words came tumbling out in a rush. "Julian, I'm so sorry. What she said about your wife, about you being dangerous, I should have known it was manipulation. I should have trusted what I felt instead of letting her—" "Stop." Julian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the rain dripping from his eyelashes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You have nothing to apologize for. She spent 20 years teaching you not to trust your own instincts. 3 weeks ago, I expected you to overcome that in a single conversation. But I hurt you, Violet said, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. I saw your face when she mentioned your wife and I panicked. I'm so broken, Julian. Maybe she was right about that. Julian's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears with infinite gentleness. You're not broken, Violet. You're wounded, and there's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed. Wounded things heal, especially when they're loved properly. The words broke something loose in Violet's chest, and she found herself stepping into his arms without conscious thought. Julian caught her against him, holding her tight as she sobbed against his shoulder, releasing weeks of suppressed grief and fear and longing. I missed you, she whispered into the warm curve of his neck. I missed you so much I could barely breathe. I know, Julian's voice was thick with his own emotion. I missed you too, every day, every hour. My apartment felt like a mausoleum without you in it. They stood there in the rain, holding each other as if they could make up for 3 weeks of separation through the strength of their embrace alone. Finally, Julian pulled back enough to look down at her face, his expression tender and concerned. You're soaked, he observed, smoothing wet strands of hair away from her forehead. And you've lost weight again. Violet looked down at herself, suddenly aware of how her clothes hung loose on her frame, how the weeks without him had undone all the progress they'd made together. She put me back on the 800-calorie diet, she said quietly. I tried to fight it, but without you, they're telling me I deserved better. It was easier to just comply. Julian's jaw tightened with fury, but his touch remained gentle as he guided her toward his car. We'll fix it, he promised. We'll fix everything. But first, let's get you warm and dry. In the warm cocoon of the Bentley's interior, Julian turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Violet, before we go any further, you need to see something. The documents I mentioned, they're all here. He reached into the back seat and retrieved a manila folder thick with papers. Financial records showing how she's been stealing from you. Medical records proving you were never diagnosed with any eating disorder. Evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and systematic abuse. Violet took the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents that laid out her mother's deception in black and white. Bank statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted from accounts that should have been hers. Medical reports that contradicted every story Helena had told about her daughter's mental health. Insurance claims for treatments that were actually luxury spa retreats. She stole from me, Violet said wonderingly, not quite able to process the scope of the betrayal. For years she's been stealing from me. More than that, Julian said gently. She stole your ability to trust yourself, your confidence, your sense of worth. She convinced you that you were dependent on her when the truth is, she's been dependent on you. The realization hit Violet like a physical blow. The apartment, her lifestyle, everything, it's all been funded by my work. Every penny, Julian confirmed. You could have been financially independent at 18, Violet. You could have made your own choices, lived your own life. She made sure you never knew that was possible. Violet closed the folder and leaned back against the leather seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. What happens now? I can't go back there, but I don't have anywhere else. You have me, Julian interrupted firmly. If you want me, if you're willing to try again, to build something real together without her poison interfering. Violet turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his storm-blue eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched on the steering wheel as he waited for her answer. What about what she said? About your wife? About you being dangerous to the women you love? Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. Sarah died in a car accident 8 years ago. We'd had a fight. I chose a business trip over a family event, and she was angry. She drove away in a snowstorm and lost control on an icy road. Julian, I blamed myself for years, he continued. If I'd made different choices, if I'd prioritized our marriage over my company, she might still be alive. Helena knew exactly which wounds to reopen. But you don't believe that anymore? Violet asked softly. Julian met her eyes with hard-won certainty. Sarah made her own choice that night. A dangerous choice, but hers to make. I can't control other people's decisions, Violet. I can only love them and hope they choose to stay. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Violet reached out to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of his evening stubble under her fingers. "I'm choosing to stay," she said simply. "If you'll have me, all of me, the wounded parts, the scared parts, the parts that still don't quite believe they're worth saving." Julian's smile was radiant with relief and joy. "I'll have all of you," he promised, catching her hand and pressing it against his cheek, "for as long as you'll let me." As he started the car and pulled away from Helena's building, Violet felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 weeks: hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles over the stolen money, emotional healing that would take time, and the challenge of building a relationship on a foundation of truth rather than manipulation. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing those challenges alone. "Take me home," she said softly, and Julian's hand found hers across the center console. "Already am," he replied, and Violet knew he wasn't talking about a destination. He was talking about the feeling of safety and belonging that enveloped her whenever she was with him. She was finally going home. 2 months had passed since Violet walked out of Helena's apartment and back into Julian's arms, and the transformation was remarkable. Standing in Julian's kitchen on a snowy December morning, watching him prepare breakfast with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else, Violet marveled at how different her life had become. The legal proceedings against Helena had been swift and decisive. Faced with irrefutable evidence of financial fraud, she had agreed to a settlement that restored Violet's stolen earnings and severed all legal ties between them. The woman who had controlled every aspect of Violet's existence for 22 years had simply disappeared from her life, leaving behind only the slow process of emotional healing. "Pancakes or French toast?" Julian asked, glancing over his shoulder with the smile that still made her pulse quicken. He was wearing jeans and a charcoal sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair slightly mussed from sleep. "Surprise me," Violet replied, curled up in the window seat with a cup of coffee, watching snow fall over Manhattan. She had gained back the weight she'd lost during their separation, but more importantly, she had begun to see food as fuel rather than enemy. Julian never commented on what or how much she ate. He simply continued to prepare beautiful, nourishing meals and trusted her body to know what it needed. "French toast it is," Julian decided, moving through the kitchen with economical grace. "With strawberries and that maple syrup from Vermont," Violet smiled, remembering their weekend trip to his cabin in the mountains, where they'd bought the syrup directly from a farm stand. It had been her first time outside New York City, without Helena's supervision, and the freedom had been intoxicating. They'd spent 3 days walking mountain trails, making love by the fireplace, and talking about everything: her dreams beyond ballet, his plans for sustainable architecture, the future they were building together one careful day at a time. The healing hadn't been linear. There were still moments when Violet would catch herself calculating calories or seeking permission for decisions that were entirely her own to make. There were nights when she woke from dreams of Helena's voice telling her she was worthless, selfish, destined to be alone. But Julian met each setback with patient understanding, never making her feel weak for struggling with programming that had taken 20 years to install. "The Times wants to do a feature story," Julian said, setting a plate of golden French toast in front of her. "About your comeback to the stage. They're calling it The Phoenix Rises." Violet's return to dancing had been another gradual process. She'd taken a leave of absence from the New York City Ballet while dealing with the legal issues, but when she was ready to come back, she'd found her technique stronger than ever. The additional weight she'd gained gave her more power in her jumps, more stability in her turns, and the emotional healing showed in every movement. She danced now with a freedom and joy that audiences could feel from the back row. "I don't know about talking to reporters," Violet said, cutting into her breakfast with appreciation. "What would I even say?" "The truth," Julian suggested, settling beside her with his own plate. "That sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones causing the most damage. That it's possible to break free from toxic patterns and build something healthy and beautiful." Violet considered this as she ate, marveling again at how different food tasted when it wasn't measured and weighed and grudgingly consumed. The French toast was perfect, crispy outside, custardy within, sweet enough to satisfy without being cloying. "Would you be in the story?" she asked. "They'd want to know about us, about what role you played in my recovery." Julian's expression grew tender as he reached out to tuck a strand of honey gold hair behind her ear. "Only if you want me to be. This is your story, Violet. Your triumph. I just happened to be lucky enough to be there when you decided to save yourself." The comment sparked something in Violet's chest, a recognition of how he always framed her healing as her own achievement rather than his rescue. It was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he saw her strength even when she couldn't see it herself. "I have something to tell you," she said, setting down her fork and turning to face him fully. "The ballet company offered me a principal contract yesterday." Julian's face lit up with pride and joy. "Violet, that's incredible. When do you start?" "That's just it," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I'm not sure I want to accept it." Julian's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he waited for her to continue without judgment or advice, another thing she'd learned to treasure about him. "Dancing was never really my choice," Violet explained. "It was Helena's dream that I inherited, and while I love it, while I'm good at it, I keep wondering what else might be out there, what I might discover about myself if I wasn't spending 8 hours a day in rehearsal studios." "What would you want to do instead?" Julian asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about teaching," Violet said, warming to the subject. "Not just ballet technique, but working with young dancers who might be in situations like mine was, helping them understand that their worth isn't measured by their weight or their willingness to sacrifice everything for their art." Julian's smile was radiant with understanding and approval. "You'd be extraordinary at that. You'd be able to spot the warning signs, to intervene before the damage becomes too deep. Would you think less of me if I gave up the principal contract to become a teacher?" Julian set down his coffee cup and took her hands in his expression serious. "Violet, I fell in love with you, not your career. If teaching makes you happy, if it feels authentic to who you're becoming, then that's what you should do. I'll support whatever choice you make." The simple acceptance brought tears to her eyes. After a lifetime of conditional approval, love dependent on achievement, worth measured by sacrifice, Julian's unconditional support still felt miraculous. "I love you," she said softly, leaning forward to kiss him with all the gratitude and affection in her heart. "I love you too," he replied against her lips, his hands cupping her face with familiar tenderness. "More every day." As they finished breakfast together, snow continuing to fall outside the windows of their sanctuary, Violet felt a peace she'd never known was possible. There would still be challenges ahead. Healing was rarely a straight line, but she no longer faced them alone. Later that afternoon, as Julian worked on architectural drawings at his drafting table and she curled up nearby with a book about dance pedagogy, her phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Violet?" The voice was tentative, uncertain. This is your grandmother, your father's mother. I've been trying to find you for years, but Helena she never let me through." Violet's breath caught in her throat. She had never known her father's family, had been told they wanted nothing to do with her and Helena. "I know this must be a shock," her grandmother continued, "but I saw the article about the legal proceedings, and I realized you might finally be free to make your own choices about relationships. Would you be willing to meet me?" Violet looked at Julian, who had stopped working and was watching her with concerned attention. He nodded encouragingly, silently communicating his support for whatever she decided. "I'd like that very much," Violet said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that very much." As she hung up the phone, Julian was already crossing the room to wrap her in his arms, understanding without words that this call represented another step in reclaiming the life that Helena had stolen from her. "Another piece of the puzzle?" he asked softly. "Another piece," Violet agreed, leaning into his strength. "I'm getting the whole picture back, aren't I?" "You're getting your life back," Julian corrected. "All of it. The good, the complicated, the beautiful mess that makes you who you are." Standing in the circle of his arms, watching snow transform the city outside their windows, Violet finally understood what healing felt like. Not a destination, but a journey. Not perfection, but wholeness. Not the absence of scars, but the courage to let them be part of her story without defining her completely. She was ready for whatever came next. Spring had arrived in Manhattan with unusual gentleness, painting Central Park in shades of green that made the city feel reborn. Violet stood at the edge of the reservoir where she had once eaten solitary lunches, but now she was surrounded by a small group of teenage dancers, their faces bright with attention, as she demonstrated a particularly challenging combination. "Remember," she said, moving through the sequence with fluid grace, "technique is important, but it serves the emotion, not the other way around. Your body is telling a story. Make sure it's one worth hearing." 6 months into her new career as a private coach and advocate for young dancers, Violet had found her calling in ways she'd never expected. Word had spread quickly through the dance community about her approach, rigorous technical training, combined with unwavering support for her students' physical and emotional well-being. Parents sought her out specifically because she understood the pressures their children faced, and more importantly, she knew how to navigate them without sacrificing health or happiness. Miss Violet, one of her students, a petite 17-year-old named Sarah, approached tentatively. "My mom wants to know if you think I should audition for that summer intensive in Russia, the one where they only accept 5 American dancers." Violet studied the girl's face, reading the mixture of excitement and anxiety there. 6 months ago, she might have encouraged Sarah to pursue the opportunity regardless of the cost. Now she asked different questions. "What do you want, Sarah? Not what your mother wants, not what might look good on your resume. What do you want?" "I want to keep dancing, but I also want to have time for my friends this summer. I want to be good, but I don't want to be miserable." Sarah's honesty was refreshing in a world where such admissions were often seen as weakness. "Then maybe this particular intensive isn't right for you," Violet said gently. "There are other ways to grow as a dancer that don't require sacrificing everything else that matters to you." As her students dispersed for the day, chattering among themselves with the easy camaraderie that came from training in an environment free from toxic competition, Violet felt the familiar satisfaction that had replaced the adrenaline rush of performance. This work fed her soul in ways she was still discovering. Her phone buzzed with a text from Julian. "Dinner at 7? I have something special planned." Violet smiled, typing back quickly, "Can't wait. Fair warning, I'm starving. Teaching makes me hungry in the best way." The response was immediate. "Good. I love feeding you." The easy intimacy of the exchange still made her chest warm with contentment. Their relationship had deepened and matured over the months, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding. They had their own routines now. Julian would often work from home on days when she was teaching nearby, and she had begun joining him occasionally on site visits to his construction projects, fascinated by the way he could envision beauty in empty lots and crumbling buildings. Julian's Tribeca penthouse had become truly theirs, filled with her books and plants, the walls hung with photographs from their travels and artwork from local galleries they'd discovered together. It felt like the home she'd never had, a space where she could be completely herself without judgment or expectation. That evening, as Violet walked into the apartment, she immediately noticed something different. Candles flickered throughout the living space, and soft jazz played in the background. The dining table was set with their good china, and she could smell something delicious coming from the kitchen. "Julian," she called, setting down her dance bag and looking around with growing curiosity. "In here," his voice came from the kitchen, carrying a note she couldn't identify. "How were the kids today?" "Wonderful," Violet replied, moving toward the kitchen. "Sarah's mom is finally backing off about that Russian intensive, and Tommy landed his first double tour. It was—" She stopped speaking as she entered the kitchen and saw Julian standing by the stove, but not cooking. Instead, he was perfectly still, watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. He was wearing the charcoal suit she'd bought him for his birthday, the one that made his eyes look like storm clouds over the ocean. "Julian," her voice was barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" Instead of answering, he moved toward her with the purposeful stride she'd come to associate with his most important decisions. When he reached her, he took both her hands in his thumbs tracing over her knuckles in the soothing gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Violet," he began, his voice rougher than usual, 8 months ago, you fell into my arms in a restaurant, and I had no idea that catching you would change everything about my life." Her breath caught as he slowly dropped to one knee, never breaking eye contact, his hands still holding hers with infinite tenderness. "You've taught me that love isn't about rescuing someone or being rescued. It's about choosing each other every day, supporting each other's growth, building something beautiful and lasting together. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that made her gasp. The diamond was perfect, not ostentatious, but clearly exceptional, set in a band of rose gold that caught the candlelight and threw rainbows across the kitchen walls. It was elegant and timeless, exactly what she would have chosen if she'd been able to imagine something so beautiful. "Violet Mercer," Julian's voice was steady now. "Sure. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how extraordinary you are? Will you build a future with me where both of us can be exactly who we're meant to be?" Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling so widely it almost hurt. This man, this beautiful, strong, patient man, wanted to marry her, not despite her scars and struggles, but including them, understanding that they were part of what made her who she was. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Julian, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, then stood and gathered her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen as she laughed through her tears. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love your strength, your compassion, the way you light up when you talk about your students. I love how you've turned your pain into purpose, how you've chosen healing over bitterness." "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Julian, but more than that, you helped me learn to save myself." "We saved each other," he corrected softly, and she knew he was right. As they stood together in their kitchen, surrounded by candles and the promise of their future, Violet thought about the girl she'd been 8 months ago, frightened, controlled, convinced she was broken beyond repair. That girl could never have imagined this moment, this man, this life built on mutual respect and unconditional love. "When?" she asked, admiring the way the ring caught the light. "Whenever you want," Julian replied. "Tomorrow, next year, whenever feels right to you. I'm not going anywhere." The certainty in his voice made her chest swell with happiness. After a lifetime of conditional love and temporary arrangements, Julian's unwavering commitment still felt miraculous. "Soon," she said, rising up to kiss him again. "I want to be your wife soon." "Mrs. Hashford," Julian said, testing the name with obvious satisfaction. "I like the sound of that." "I love the sound of that," Violet corrected, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like forever. Outside their windows, Manhattan glittered in the spring darkness, a city full of possibility and new beginnings. But inside their home, two people who had found each other against all odds were already living their happily ever after, one chosen moment at a time. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with promise and rich with love, and Violet finally understood what it meant to be free, not from difficulty or challenge, but free to face whatever came with someone who would stand beside her through it all, free to be loved exactly as she was, and to love just as fiercely in return. 2 years later, the garden at Julian's estate in the Hamptons was a masterpiece of late summer beauty, with white roses climbing trellises and fairy lights strung between ancient oak trees that would soon witness the most important day of Violet's life. She stood at the bedroom window of the main house, wearing a silk robe and watching the final preparations unfold below, her engagement ring catching the golden afternoon light. "You're glowing," said Carmen, her maid of honor, as she arranged the delicate pearl pins in Violet's hair. "Literally glowing. Marriage agrees with you already." Violet laughed, touching her still flat stomach with wonder. "That might not just be happiness," she admitted, turning to face her friend with eyes bright with joy and secrets. "Violet!" Carmen's eyes went wide. "Are you—" "6 weeks," Violet confirmed, her smile radiant. "I found out yesterday. Julian doesn't know yet. I wanted to tell him after the ceremony." The thought of Julian's reaction when she told him made her chest flutter with anticipation. They had talked about children, about the family they wanted to build together, but having it become reality so soon felt like an extraordinary gift. "He's going to lose his mind with happiness," Carmen said, then paused in her work. "How do you feel? Are you scared at all?" "Terrified," Violet admitted honestly. "But not about being a mother, about being the kind of mother I want to be instead of the kind I knew growing up." It was true. The thought of Helena's parenting methods filled her with determination to do everything differently. Her children would know they were loved unconditionally. They would be encouraged to trust their instincts, to take up space, to believe they deserved good things simply by virtue of existing. "You're going to be amazing," Carmen said firmly. "Look how you are with your students. Look how you've healed yourself. This baby is going to be so lucky." A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Julian's voice came through the wood. "Can I see my bride? I know it's supposed to be bad luck, but I have something for you." Violet opened the door to find Julian in his black tuxedo, looking so handsome it made her breath catch. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his storm blue eyes held a tenderness that made her want to forget about the ceremony and just fall into his arms. "You're supposed to wait," she protested weakly, but she was already reaching for him. "Since when do I follow rules when it comes to you?" Julian replied, pulling her against him for a kiss that was both chaste and deeply intimate. "You look absolutely radiant." "So do you," she murmured against his lips, then pulled back with a mischievous smile. "I have news for you." "After," Julian said, pressing a small velvet box into her hands. "Whatever it is, I want to hear it after we're married. Right now, I have something for you." Violet opened the box to find a delicate necklace, a single pearl on a platinum chain, simple and elegant and perfect for her dress. "It was my grandmother's," Julian explained, his voice soft with memory. "She wore it on her wedding day, and my mother wore it on hers. I wanted you to have it to know that you're not just becoming my wife. You're becoming part of a family that will love you unconditionally." Tears threatened her carefully applied makeup as Julian fastened the necklace around her throat, his fingers gentle against her nape. "Thank you," she whispered. "Julian, I save it for the vows," he said, kissing her forehead tenderly. "I'll see you at the altar, Mrs. Almost Ashford." As he left, Violet touched the pearl at her throat and thought about family, the one she'd been born into and the one she was about to join. Julian's parents had embraced her immediately, treating her with the warmth and acceptance she'd never known was possible. His mother had helped plan the wedding with enthusiasm, never once making Violet feel like an outsider or charity case. Even more surprising had been the relationship she'd built with her paternal grandmother, Margaret, who had become a source of stories about the father Violet had never known and wisdom about navigating life as a strong woman. Margaret would be in the front row today, beaming with pride as her newfound granddaughter married the love of her life. "Time to get dressed," Carmen announced, lifting the wedding gown from its hanger with reverent care. The dress was perfection, ivory silk that skimmed Violet's curves without clinging, with delicate lace sleeves that made her feel both elegant and modest. The neckline was perfect for showing off Julian's grandmother's necklace, and the flowing skirt moved like water when she walked. As Carmen fastened the tiny buttons that ran up the back of the dress, Violet caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and had to pause. The woman looking back at her was healthy, glowing, confident in her own skin. Her face had filled out to reveal the high cheekbones and delicate features that had been hidden by years of malnutrition. Her body was strong and curved in all the right places, a dancer's physique maintained by joy rather than fear. "Perfect," Carmen breathed. "Absolutely perfect." The ceremony itself was intimate. Just 50 of their closest friends and family gathered in Julian's garden as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Violet's students had made her a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, their card reading, "Thank you for teaching us that strong women support each other." As the string quartet began the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon, Violet took Margaret's arm and began her walk down the petal-strewn aisle. But her eyes were only for Julian, who stood under the rose-covered arch looking at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. When she reached him, he took her hands in his thumbs tracing over her knuckles in their familiar gesture of comfort and connection. "You are absolutely breathtaking," he murmured, for her ears alone. "So are you," she replied, and meant it completely. The ceremony was everything she'd dreamed. Heartfelt vows spoken in voices thick with emotion, rings exchanged with trembling hands, the pronouncement that made them husband and wife, followed by a kiss that lasted long enough to make their guests cheer and laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant announced with obvious joy, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Julian Ashford." As they walked back down the aisle together, Hands joined and faces glowing with happiness, Violet felt the last piece of her healing click into place. She was safe, she was loved, and she was exactly where she belonged. The reception was magical. Dinner under the stars, dancing on the terrace with Manhattan's skyline twinkling in the distance, toasts that made them both cry with laughter and joy. Julian never left her side, his hand always finding hers, his eyes never straying far from her face. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift toward waiting cars, Julian pulled Violet aside for a private moment in the garden where they'd exchanged vows. "Now," he said, cupping her face in his hands, "what was that news you wanted to share?" Violet took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, watching his expression change from curiosity to wonder to absolute elation as understanding dawned. "We're having a baby," she said softly. "In about 7 months you're going to be a father." Julian's response was to lift her off her feet and spin her around, his laughter ringing through the garden as tears of joy streamed down his face. "We're having a baby," he repeated wonderingly, setting her down gently and pressing his forehead to hers. "Violet, this is perfect. You're perfect. Our life is perfect." "Not perfect," she corrected with a smile, "but real, and ours, and full of love." As they stood together in their garden, surrounded by the remnants of their wedding celebration and the promise of their future, Violet thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first night when she'd collapsed in a restaurant to this moment of absolute happiness, every step had led them to each other. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, reading her expression with the intimacy of a man who knew every nuance of her face. "Just how grateful I am, for all of it, even the difficult parts, because they led me to you." "No," Julian said softly, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "They led us to each other. And now we have forever to figure out what comes next." "Forever sounds perfect," Violet said, rising up to kiss her husband under a canopy of stars. And as they stood there, two people who had found healing in each other's arms, surrounded by love and looking toward a future bright with possibility. They both knew that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that begin with learning to save yourself. But they're made perfect by finding someone who chooses to stay beside you through healing and growth, and all the beautiful complications of building a life together. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.